Welcome to the Foster Friendly Podcast, where we come together to make a difference in the lives of children in foster care and the families who care for them. Foster Friendly communities are part of a nationwide movement by America's Kids Belong that helps people from all walks of life take action and help kids and families thrive. You'll hear from former foster youth, foster and adoptive parents, social workers, faith and business leaders, and other experts on how to engage in meaningful ways. Our hosts Brian, Travis, and Courtney explore inspiring stories of everyday people making a difference in foster care where they live and work.
Hello, welcome to the Foster Friendly Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Mavis, and I have with me my great colleague and co-host, Courtney Williams. And Courtney, I am really excited about our interview today. So for a couple reasons. One is our guest, Jenni, is a friend of mine who I really enjoy spending time with. And secondly, she has launched and runs a nonprofit that is profoundly important and profoundly powerful. And I'm looking forward to hearing from her. And I think our listeners are going to benefit greatly. So, Courtney, why don't you introduce Jenni Lord to our audience?
Okay, yeah. Jenni Lord is a dedicated advocate for change in the child welfare space. She challenges systems and policies to shift from a focus on physical safety to pursuing true well-being and healing from trauma. In 2008, she founded Chosen, an organization that empowers parents and caregivers to lead change in their family, helping their children heal through their connections. She's an engaging speaker and podcast guest who inspires others with passion for healing through authentic connection and family restoration that leads to systemic transformation. So, Jenni, again, welcome to the podcast today. We're so grateful for you to take time out of your schedule to join us. And why don't you just start by telling us a little bit more about yourself personally and your connection to this space and your story?
Awesome. Thanks, Brian and Courtney, so much for having me. Courtney, that was a mouthful. That was a lot of syllables. I was cheering you on silently inside.
Done a lot.
Yeah, well, no, somebody's writing was a lot of syllables. Well, thanks for having me. This is such a joy and a privilege to be with you all today. So first of all, I am married to one husband and mom to four teenagers. My husband and I have we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary, and yay us! 2 decades is a long time, but it has been a lot of fun and quite an adventure to be married to somebody who is also entrepreneurial and a visionary. So there's two of us in that mind space in our household, and then we've got 4 teenagers from 14 to 19. So we're a lot going on, and I live just in South Central Texas, and have founded, as you said, and led the organization Chosen for the last 15 years, and so that's just a little bit at high level about me, and I can tell you more about the organization. I don't know all the questions, but if you want me to start about that, I can certainly jump off.
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious to know what led you to that. What's your personal connection to getting to the point of launching Chosen?
Yeah, so I've personally been connected to this space for almost 30 years, and I know you can't tell. I'm too young for that, but personally for 30 and professionally for 15. I have a brother who was adopted out of foster care, and he came into our home in the 90s, and I was a teenager, and he was a toddler, and so that experience marked my life tremendously. His adoption took almost 5 years to complete. So through that experience, I saw the inside of the child welfare system. I saw how a system that's designed to protect children often brings them harm. I saw how they could fall through the cracks. And the Lord used that experience to break my heart for vulnerable children whose voices often aren't heard. And that was kind of the starting place. And then fast forward about 10 years, my best friend adopted from Guatemala, and that was my first inside view of the international crisis and the orphan crisis around the world. And that was at the time when the church was really waking up in the 2000s. Wow, we have an orphan crisis across the world. We have a foster care crisis in our backyard. And the church was really rising up to do something about it. And that was a big topic in our community. And so my best friend that adopted Clay from Guatemala, he was just a little guy, but they were navigating that uh, alone. They didn't know what they were doing, and there were a lot of families in our community who were saying, "Wow, like I would do something too if I knew where to start or if we had the funding." And that was just kind of an ongoing conversation in my community. And what led me to start this, of all the things that God could use, was running. I had started my family. We had a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old, and a newborn. So let that sink in for a second. 2-year-old, 1-year-old, and a newborn. And I needed some me time because it was hard to find, right? And I also wanted to get back in shape. And so I started running again, just to get back in shape. And some friends asked if I wanted to do a half marathon with them. And so we signed up to do the San Antonio Rock and Roll first inaugural marathon in 2008. We trained for it for 5 months. It was 13.1 miles, and I loved the running. It was definitely a reprieve from babies and diapers and all the things, and running with my training partners. And we got to the start line with 30,000 other people. And if you've been to any kind of major sporting event, the air is electrifying, right? Except in this case, I was not a spectator, I was a participant. And so there's adrenaline and excitement, and it's cold, and all this build up to the day of this race and reaching this big accomplishment. And I had what I would call just a defining moment. It was like in the movies when the crowd goes quiet and all I could hear was like this loud question in my head. And I said it out loud to my training partners. I was like, why am I doing this? I need to be doing this for something I believe in. All of that work seemed meaningless. Like it was just for me. And God used that experience to just say, what if we were running for something like adoption? What if we were running to help kids who needed families? And so for 2 hours and 14 minutes, that was what we talked about, is what if we had a race and raised money to help adoptive families? And then for 6 weeks, like the Lord just wouldn't let it rest. And I really wasn't trying to start an organization or a nonprofit. I just had an idea to help people. And I said yes to the Lord and kind of backed into the space, and an organization grew up around me. And so that was the starting point. It's certainly evolved since then, but he used not what was in my hands, but what was at my feet to start me on this professional journey.
So keep going. One, I didn't even know. I thought I knew your story, and I didn't know about that race and that defining moment at the start. But then, so you kind of unintentionally start a nonprofit, and it's also seen its iterations or some adaptations along the way. So, so bring us through that a little bit up to its current mission.
Yeah. So, Brian, you know this from starting an organization, and like I say this a lot, one obedient yes to the Lord, like we really don't know what's on the other side of that.
Yeah, it's like you're at the Denver airport, and you just took one step, but it was onto a moving sidewalk.
That's
You're
good.
like,
Or a
whoa,
roller coaster.
where are we going?
I mean,
Yeah, right.
might be a roller coaster, let's just say, for any wannabe founders out there. Yeah, I just said yes. And I did feel like it was an obedient step of faith. And from that, the Lord used that yes to open my eyes to a world that I thought I knew a little bit about. Like my brother at that point in time had been in our family for probably 12 years or so. So I had lived through the effects of trauma, which we didn't know. Like we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have the resources. We certainly didn't understand the long-term effects of trauma to the brain and how that shapes the way that child responds to the world. I just had a desire. Two things, I didn't say this in the buildup. Between my brother's adoption and the idea for Chosen, there was a middle point where God opened my eyes to the revelation that I had been adopted. Like he had adopted me into his eternal family. I grew up in a denomination where that was not taught when I was a child. Like I did not have an understanding of that. So that when I got that revelation, that made adoption so much more special and meaningful to me. And it had already impacted my life in such a profound way with my brother. And so knowing that and just wanting a child to never feel alone, abandoned, that was what got me into it. And so I said yes. And for 5 years, at that time, the race market wasn't saturated. There was only really one race that was raising money for a cause, and that was Susan G. Komen. Today is a totally different story. Back then, that didn't exist. And so what we were doing was novel in that time frame. And for 5 years, we raised money and helped adoptive families, and we built teams around those families that community support, advocating for them, people walking along, running alongside them in their journey to bring a child into their home, championing them, and so forth. We raised a significant amount of money and helped to fund about 400 adoptions. And so I loved that. It was super special. It was very meaningful in the community that I live in. We eventually had races in multiple cities across the US. And 5 years into it, I learned it gets me every
It
time.
hits you. Yeah. Yeah.
About 10 years ago, I learned that people were dissolving adoptions and putting kids back into the system. And at that time, nobody was really talking about that. It was actually kind of this black underbelly of the adoption world where it was like talked about in whispers, and the Christian world, you kind of knew who to call if you needed help, but it wasn't public. The government wasn't tracking it. And when I learned about that, I just thought, man, that for a child to feel that sense of abandonment again, and that being alone again, like the Lord used that understanding to like break my heart. And I said to our very small team at the time, we can't do everything, but I feel like we have a stewardship responsibility. Like we've been advocating and calling people into this space for years, like people who had experienced this community in a race setting and been like, maybe my family could do this too. And so good-hearted, well-meaning, well-intentioned people saying yes to open their hearts and home and not knowing what they were actually saying yes to. Like we have a stewardship responsibility. Like we're giving them some funds, but who's walking with these families long term to make sure that they have what they need to help their child heal and to keep going, to stay together? And so that question was the beginning of what I call our missional evolution into what we do today.
Yeah, that was a big, big change.
It was a huge change, and but it was a stewardship responsibility. And I went to the leadership and at the board at the time and said, this is the direction that I really believe that God is leading us into, to be responsive to these families' needs. We had gone to some national leaders at the time and said, who's walking alongside families like down the road when it hits the fan and they don't know what to do? And that national leader said, we don't know. We have families calling us every week in crisis and we don't know where to send them. So if you find them, can you let us know? And because my thought was, let's just replicate something that's working out there. Like, let's do, there has to be a model. And at the time in 2014, there just wasn't, we couldn't find a good answer for what we were looking for. And so we made a change, and we didn't quit funding adoptions immediately, but we gradually just stepped away from that. That was how people knew us. And so there's grief like in the community of like, oh, you're not doing that anymore. I'm like, well, there's others that are doing that, but we couldn't find organizations that were really walking with families long term. That's the landscape has changed greatly in the last 10 years, but our evolution was in response to.
So, Jenny, before we go into kind of the looking for answers and guidance for people, I want to take a little moment and probe the problem a little bit more. And so, can you paint a picture for us of what it looks like when a family says yes and they start fostering or they adopt and they don't understand the issues of trauma or attachment? Kind of like what's that? What are they experiencing?
Yeah, so the simple way that I like to explain it for people who don't live in our space every day is that, trauma, the root word, the origin of the word trauma, it actually means wound. So wounds from loss, the loss and separation from a first family, that could include abuse, that could include neglect, domestic violence, substance abuse, whatever they've been exposed to. But underneath all of those labels, there's loss because there's separation from the first family. And all loss has to be grieved, right? And so it's grieved in a developmental way over time. We know this from our own experiences that sometimes grief surfaces out of nowhere about something that happened a long time ago. Well, for a child who doesn't have the language to articulate that loss, typically they may not even understand it. The way that it manifests in the home is through behavior. And sometimes really challenging behaviors. So you know this, both of you, from being foster and adoptive parents. Family's excited, like with my brother, like, oh my gosh, he's coming. We have like a couple hours notice. Everybody, when we were foster parents, like my little kids, like they clean the house faster than they've ever cleaned the house before.
Right.
They're so excited. Like, well, we're excited on our end, and that child is not necessarily going to be excited or happy walking through the door. Like you as the new family represent loss. You represent, and the primary caregivers up to that point in their life have failed them. So if they have failed them, why would this little kid who's 5 years old walking into your house trust you? Like, you're just a stranger. They don't know that you're good and nice and going to treat them well. So that, because of what has happened to them, most kids who've experienced that kind of trauma, they often live in their fear brain, where it is fight, flight, or freeze. They're not saying I feel scared. That's how they're in their bodies. The cortisol, the stress hormone that's running through them. Oftentimes we see kids who have been in survival mode for a long time, so they've learned to scrounge for themselves or their siblings to find food or whatever it may be. And then you bring them and plop them down into some semblance of normalcy. Well, they're not going to just click right in with the other family members, right? And so the way that they often act is very challenging for a new family. And sometimes sometimes it's not right away. There is a honeymoon period. Sometimes it's not for years. But then because trauma is developmental and does come out at different developmental milestones in a child's life, it manifests in the home in sometimes very harmful ways, where the child is harming themselves, they're harming others, they might be aggressive or violent even. But I like to say it like this. Y'all have kids. I have 4 teenagers. And when they start acting crazy, like my go-to is not to like lean in, like, let me just try to build connection right now. I'm like, no, I just like want to nip it in the bud, want to shut it down. Like, you need to go or I'm going to go. Like, right. Like, this isn't, well, that doesn't work for a child who has experienced profound harm in their life, where their primary caregivers have failed them. And you just start adding that up. If a kid has moved multiple times, and then it's every adult has failed them. So what is needed to build healthy attachment with a child is it is to lean in and build that connection. But when a child is acting out, that isn't a parent's natural tendency to like lean into build the connection and attachment at that point. You want the crazy to stop. And so that's the challenge, is those behaviors that often prevent healthy connection from actually happening in the home and further drive the adults away from the child rather than towards the child.
Parenting kids impacted by trauma can feel overwhelming, but with Chosen, real connection and real change is possible. Using a family systems approach, Chosen equips foster, adoptive, kinship, and reunified families with personalized treatment plans, weekly parent coaching, and on-demand crisis support. With trauma responsive training and tools tailored to each family, they're empowering caregivers and professionals to foster healing nationwide. Visit chosen.care to learn how Chosen services can make a difference in your family's life. Yeah, and the late Dr. Karen Purvis says that children are harmed in relationships and they're going to be healed in relationships. And so, as you're saying, families have such an important part of this equation, right? The families that are welcoming these kids in. So, what do those family members need to do for themselves to be equipped for that journey, that long journey? Hopefully, I call it a marriage of adoption. It's not something to be broken, right? It's supposed to be forever. What can we do to support ourselves or to be prepared in a way that supports everyone's needs?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of things, right? There's a lot of steps to what does it take to um, as the adult. I think before I answer that, Courtney, I think kind of honing in on a second problem after the first problem of like what behaviors look like from the manifestation of trauma. Our system tends to put the onus of healing on the child. Like the services are geared towards the child. Yeah, they often have adequate. They might have access to multiple types of therapy and so forth, but a child heals in the context of a family system. God's design was family, right? And we have to recognize as the adults our responsibility and the burden of responsibility to build connection. Like the for a child to lean in and build connection, that's not their responsibility. That's our responsibility. So I think it's first just recognizing that truly as a parent or caregiver of a child who has experienced trauma, you can be the linchpin for an agent of healing for your child. And that's what we equip families with, is that knowledge and understanding of you are an agent of healing in your home. A child is not going to heal in a therapist's office 1 hour a week or twice a month when the bulk of their waking hours are with you, and you have these micro opportunities to build healthy connection, to rewire the brain. And so, Courtney, I think first is just the education. It's one thing to be licensed and you go through the training before a child's in your home, but then it's like, what happens when the 4-year-old is flipping you off and cussing you out in real time? Like, they didn't really tell me how to handle this in my foster care licensing training, right? How do I respond to this in a connected way? And so I would say it's not just pre-education, it's ongoing education to meet the child's need that's in your home. But I think the other thing is this: it beyond just trauma education, it is, what do I have to have to regulate myself? So when parents come to us or caregivers come to us, we don't just look at the child's history, we also look at the parent's history and the overall picture of the home. Because oftentimes what we find is unhealed trauma in a parent or caregiver's past is contributing to the chaos in the home in ways that they may not even be aware of. So they're coming to us saying, the child has all these problems. They're not talking about themselves, right? They might know that they're having a challenge parenting him, but how are they contributing to that? And so understanding your own needs so that you can be regulated. An unregulated adult cannot help regulate a dysregulated child. And I have certainly learned that with my teenagers. And I wish that I had had the tools and resources that Chosen provides to families when I started parenting 19 years ago. I learned this stuff about 10 years into parenting my own kids, and I had to really change a lot of the ways that I was interacting with my kids. My strategies, our strategies as parents are often based on how we were raised, right? And I like to say, like, I had 12 weeks of birthing classes before I had a baby, and then I had 0 days of parenting classes. And so you're just parenting from what you know. And my strategy is more centered around like control and correction versus connection. And those are very different ways of parenting. And it required a lot of humility. And I think that that's one of the factors that it requires of parents, is to say, how am I contributing to what's happening in my home, and what do I need to change?
Yeah, that's huge. Um, I love your ministry, and I want to take some time for you to explain exactly what you do. So people out there listening, there might be people right now who are saying, "I need exactly what you have, what you give." But before we go there, I just want to unpack one other thing that people you touched on a little bit, but I want to kind of shine a light a little bit more on it. This unrealized other layer of hurt, and that's when you have a child who's because of something uh, really bad, the extreme neglect or abuse of any kind, all kinds. Uh, it was determined the best thing to do to keep them safe was to remove them from their family who was hurting them and then place them into another family for it to be fostered or maybe then adopted. um, what looks like the the solution, and it is, it is a solution, but what looks like the lifeline um, to the child, that's yet another um, ironically another potential wound of like it kind of. So can you unpack that? What again? What it looks like from an adult side of things is like this is actually, and maybe it's both. I mean, this is something that's healing this moment, but it also to the child might represent another wound. Am I saying that clearly enough for you to understand what I'm trying to get at, or even correct me if you think I'm off track?
Yeah, I think I remember when I first started the organization 15 years ago, in the foster and adoption space, there's a lot of hero language
Yeah. There you go. Okay.
and a lot of rescue language. They're rescuing kids. Man, that sounds really noble and good. And I there has been a shift. Thank God, there has been a shift away from that language. I still hear it from time to time where people just don't know, because when 15 years ago, when people were fostering and adopting, and even still, sometimes as a community we set them up for failure because we do put them on a pedestal, and you hear it, people say things like, man, I could never do that, you are so amazing. Like, they elevate them to this status. And then when it gets really hard for a parent and they don't have a safe place to go, this is terrible. Like, we think that we might have ruined our family, or like, my marriage is falling apart because of the stress from bringing this child into our home. Like, that's not hero status. That is a recipe for isolation, because people around you have said you're the hero. So I think it started with this notion of like rescue, or like we're saving children. And the reality is, like, if there is any way possible to restore that first family back, then as people of, as kingdom minded people, we want to do that, right? Like, we want to restore families back to healing. And most kids, almost without exception, that I have seen, they desire to be with their first family. Like, even people who were hurting them, they long for them. There is a biological component to that that's just indisputable. And so when you remove a child and new family, Courtney's new family looks safe and happy and stable, and you represent, like, no, you're the people who took me away, or the caseworker, as though, you took me away from my family. They kids don't say this generally, but there is a loss of that first family. And I know when we adopted my brother, we just didn't understand. Like, 30 years ago, you think you're doing this great and noble thing, and
And you
yet
are. It is good. I
it
mean,
is it
but it's
is
but it's not. But it's yeah. It comes with some complications.
and just and I don't think that we had value, like, first family seemed more like a threat. We didn't make the space to value and honor what was good, or what could have been good. So I think that we have made a lot of mistakes as in our sector with not doing that well, to make space for grief that children feel and don't have language to express about that separation of first family. And they have to grieve it, or it will manifest in very harmful ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted our audience who may not, it may not dawn on them that is, in a sense, ironically, another wound for the child.
I'll tell you a story that just, and I know you want to talk a little bit about the way that we work with families, but a family just came to us recently. They adopted 2 children who are now teenagers. The kids have been in their home for over 10 years, and they're in a state of crisis. Hit those teenage years, and a lot of unhealed stuff from the first 3 years of this little boy's life just has been like buried and latent, and parents didn't know. Like, they didn't have trauma education. They came to us, and they were one of those families 15 years ago, like in that adoption pool, just thinking that they did a good thing, and they've been struggling for 10 years and finally are getting some help so that their child can remain in the home. So that's kind of an example of just like, they, in fact, when I asked them, have you had trauma education? They weren't really connecting the behaviors that they were seeing, the dangerous behaviors that they were seeing. They weren't connecting that really to him being adopted. He's been in the home for more than 10 years. He's been loved well, and they've raised 4 other kids. So do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. I do. Yeah.
Yeah, such good stuff, and just so true. We adopted our daughter. She was in an adoptive home before our home, and that failed, and so we know the added layers of loss too that is often overlooked, and not even just in adoption and foster care. A current kiddo in our home has been in 7 homes within a couple of years, and he talks about that. Like, I feel like people give up on me for the easiest things, and I'm in another home and I have to start all over again. And it's just these things that the general public doesn't recognize or know. And as foster and adoptive homes, if we don't have training and understanding, we're just going to add to that, add layers to their trauma. We don't want to do that. Again, we didn't enter this realm of foster care or adoption to be heroes, right? But we want to help it aid in the healing and not add to the trauma. So tell us a little bit more about Chosen. Tell us what you are currently doing, how families can get involved, in the education that you provide, and how you help equip them.
Sure. So we believe that connection is the gateway to healing. And that's based on science. It's also based on scripture. God is always pursuing connection with us, even when we're ignoring him, running away from him, turning our backs on him. He's always pursuing our hearts and pursuing that connection with us. And that's what we teach families, is to pursue their child's heart in the same way that God is always pursuing connection with us. So when a family comes to us, and this is for our parent-directed services, this is the bulk of what we do now. When they come to us, we have a parent coaching model, and we're going to equip and empower parents with the tools and strategies that they need to build healthy relational connection with their child, to help restore those broken places in their brain that have been harmed from trauma and from the losses that they've experienced prior to that. So when a family comes to us, we do a few different things on the front end. We take some clinical assessments. We look at the trauma behaviors of the children, looking at 13 different domains. So things like PTSD, aggression, anxiety, depression, and so forth. And that gives us just a picture of what's going on with the child in the home. We also look at parental stress levels, and we look at protective factors in the home. We want to make sure that kids are safe, right? Because sometimes when things are spiraling, they can be at risk again. So we look at that. We take the child's history, but also the parental history, and we also look at what else is going on with other siblings, or if there are other adults in the home. We get a comprehensive picture, and from that, we create something called a trauma responsive action plan. That is individualized treatment plan for what's happening in the home. So when I say individualized, it just means it's customized for the needs. If Brian's raising teenagers and having problems, we're not going to have the same course of action for the next 4 to 6 months that we would with somebody who's raising toddlers, right? It's going to look differently. And then they're going to be assigned to a care manager who is going to meet with them at least on a weekly basis. That's prescriptive, but we also take crisis calls and work with families after hours. We know that meltdowns don't happen between 8 and 5, Monday through Friday. So the responsiveness is huge because that really gives access to a family real time to solve challenges when a child is dysregulated. But we're going to put together that action plan, and every week they're going to work through what it looks like to build incremental, small daily doses of connection with their child. And we're going to tackle the very first thing that they're dealing with that is most challenging. So, like with that family that I just mentioned a minute ago, there was a safety concern. This youth has become aggressive and violent, and there's a safety concern in the home. So we have to address that immediately, right? And put some plans into place to make sure that everyone stays safe and that he's able to continue staying at home and getting the services that he needs as well. And then from that, so it's parent coaching. And it's real time. Like I used this example earlier, like what I learned in my pre-training, I need to know how to apply that trauma. We don't say trauma informed. We are teaching trauma responsive tactics to respond in a way that is trauma informed, but also connecting to build connection in the moment with your child. And we're going to hold parents accountable to making those changes in their home. So we do that on a weekly basis. And we measure for 4 to 6 months after the beginning of services, we measure those clinical markers again to make sure that those domains are coming down. So if there was a clinical number for anxiety and depression, we're making sure that those are going in the right direction. But from what we have seen, and just in this past year, 91% of families say that we helped them address the largest problems in their home and to keep going. We've had 100% success rate this year in keeping families together. And that's our goal, because 80% of them that come to us are in a crisis. They're saying, we don't know if we can keep going. And our goal is to make sure they have the tools that they need to keep going.
Is this a Texas thing, a national thing, is online? What does it practically look like?
Yeah, good question. So we have a telehealth model, and we have been using that telehealth model since 2017, long before COVID. So we serve families from around the country, and parents love it because we can meet with them from their kitchen table or at their office. They can close the door or whatever it might be, but it allows us to meet with families on their schedule when they need it and not drag their kids to one more appointment.
I love it. And I love how you said that the trauma responsive. I tell foster families all the time, I want to help your family members, your friends, your neighbors become trauma informed, but you need to be trauma responsive. And there is a difference, and understanding the difference. It is an undertaking as foster family, but it's a commitment that we need to be willing to do to make these kids successful in our homes.
Yeah, so that's our kind of meat and potatoes day-to-day work. We also have a content and training initiative that is releasing real-time content that is helpful for families, like practical tools that you can implement in your home today, where you don't have to have that full 4 to 6 month engagement. Those tools are being released online on a consistent basis, and we have multiple training offerings that are happening around, throughout the year, and those are open. Some of those are dedicated resources, like we've done it for certain organizations where they want the offering to only be for their families. We do that kind of work, but we also have some quarterly trainings that are offered as well. And we're addressing through our training. There's a lot of training out there, but the training that we have honed in on is really, it's very similar to what we do with the parent coaching. We're filling niches where there are gaps in services. So as an example, one of our training offerings is addressing problematic sexual behaviors. Why? Because there was nothing out there. And that's why homes melt down and kids don't get placed, is because of problematic sexualized behaviors. And so just tools like that are super practical and needed for families. And it's a lower bar for engagement if you're looking for some additional resources to learn from.
So Jenni, amazing statistics, and so now I want to hear an amazing story. What's one of your favorite transformation stories of like, here was a family, here's their kind of their before picture, and here's their after picture.
Yeah, so I didn't say this before, but we really serve primarily 4 different types of families. We've talked about foster and adoptive. We also serve kinship families, relative caregivers, as well as reunified families, families who can be safely reunified to help build some of that resiliency that has been lacking. And one of my favorite stories is a recent story of a family who took in a relative. They took in a nephew from out of state, and this nephew did not know them very well. He was 11 years old when they brought them into the home. They got kind of a crisis call like, hey, mom is strung out again on drugs. She's not safe. We don't know where she is. And the children in the home had been fending for themselves for quite some time. And so they took this relative in, and the home, they had 3 boys of their own. So they had an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 12-year-old, and they brought in an 11-year-old nephew. So y'all know on this screen, when you add a kid in that mix of ages in the middle of that, like that's already like there's already going to be complications from that, right? So this is a really sweet, God-loving family. The dad, he grew up helping orphanages and kids in orphanages in Mexico when he was a kid. So he had a heart and passion for this. And he's like, we're going to live out the gospel. Like, hey boys, like this is our opportunity to like lay down our lives, for this family member. And that gentleman had served on boards in our space, not on Chosen's board, but on another board in this space. So these are people who are going in eyes wide open. Like, we understand, like, this is going to be hard, right? Well, they did not understand how difficult it was going to be. He had lived in so many years of neglect that really changes brain chemistry and changes the way that this child interacts with the world, right? And we see that a lot. But he came in, I mean, he didn't know what sitting down for family dinner looked like. He didn't even have some of the tools on using silverware properly. And so this family, like, they're starting at ground zero with this 11-year-old boy, and they've had an 11-year-old, and they have a son who's almost 11. Like, they know what 11-year-old boys like, need, etc. And except they didn't know what it was going to be like when he didn't have all of those basic fundamental building blocks for a healthy relational connection within family. And so when Andrew came into their family, it was not going well. They had a very difficult time understanding his behaviors, how he was talking. His meltdowns looked more like a 3-year-old than an 11-year-old, which we often see because trauma stunts the brain. And he had missed some of those early milestones of just typical nurturing and caretaking. And he didn't have the skills to regulate himself. So not only was it very difficult for mom and dad, aunt and uncle, who are now, filling in for mom and dad, it was extremely difficult for their boys because we're going to lay down our lives for the gospel. And now this kid is like ruining our lives. Like, he's taking things from me. He's taking more attention from mom and dad than I'm used to getting. So it was very destabilizing for the entire family. So when they came in, we started working with them right out of the gate. This is not typical. And so for any listeners out there, if you're thinking, I might need these services, just don't wait. Like, just don't wait. They didn't wait. They knew about Chosen Services and they got in from the outset. That's not typical. What is typical is like the other situation I talked about, where families struggle 6, 8, 10 years and the wheels are really coming off and they're in full-blown crisis. And so they were working to avoid that crisis. But in addition to training mom and dad on the effects of trauma on the brain and how that had affected Andrew's ability to relate, ability to process, and ability to it really function, was extremely helpful for them. But we gave them some practical tools that they could use with their biological boys as well, just to show them like, this is what happened to his brain. And Andrew hasn't had the same opportunities and privileges that you have had in a stable family that's always been together. And so that helped just their boys, give them a different layer of compassion for Andrew and to make space for him. But one of the things that I loved about this family was they so Andrew loved to draw. That was like that was his world, is like he loved to draw. And so they got him some tools, right when he came into the home with like, but he was very closed and very private about his drawings. He didn't, that's like his little safe world, right? And so one of the things that the dad told me, and he broke down in tears recently just sharing this with me. He said, yeah, we had a meeting at the kids' school, and we saw Andrew, like, they had like an administration meeting, and they were walking out of the office, and they saw Andrew in the hallway, and he said, look what I just drew. And he opened up his thing and showed it to him in the hallway. And the dad told me, I would have missed how significant that was if I didn't have the education that I learned from Chosen, because he was, because we've been so intentional to build connection with him, he's finally feeling safe enough to let us into his world, to see what is he treasures and values and has kept hidden from them. And that took almost a year of working before he would allow them into his world. And so I love that story. And that they've got a long way to go. Their services with us lasted about 6 months, but they're in a much more stable place. And that story happened after we had already completed services, and Dad wanted to share that specifically with me because it was so significant to them. But he said, and this is what the mom told me. She said, Jenni, if I got a diagnosis that was acute, I would go get a specialist. And what we found with Chosen was with Andrew, we just went to the specialist. Like there was no one else in our orbit that had the skills and knowledge to teach us what we needed to even attempt to build connection with this child who didn't have any. And so, I liked that because, and we're for anybody, but the expertise that our team can provide to build healthy connection and to overcome any obstacle and challenge. Like we believe that no child is beyond the hope of healing. That comes from our faith orientation, right? We've seen impossible situations, kids who have been removed from the home and been jailed. And you're like, that kid's not going back because he hurt somebody else in the home. And we've seen those situations restored. So when she says we're a specialist, like we are in that way, because we're going to move heaven and earth to make sure that you have what you need to keep going.
Well, as we close out this episode, Jenni, most of our listeners are foster parents or those that are considering fostering. So could you answer this question for us? How would you finish the sentence? What kids in foster care really need is
healthy connection.
That's great. And it's what you teach too. It'll benefit every relationship you have. I mean, not just the hurting child. I mean, and so for our listeners out there, again, I respect and admire Jenni. Love the ministry she's led, and so Jenni, for our listeners, some who are maybe are in crisis, some who are like, I'm not going to let it get to a crisis. Some who are saying, I want to go into this even before I have a kid, understanding. But how can they find out more about you, how to get involved? What's their next step?
Yeah, so our website is chosen.care. We'd love to connect with you. It's very simple. Our commitment to you is that if you connect with us through our webpage, we're going to get back to you right away. We don't want families waiting to get services. we get you in the door as quickly as possible and address, like I said, that the most pressing need in your home. So me personally, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or on Instagram, and our website again is chosen.care, and we'd love to hear from you. And I want to echo what Brian said. What I'm talking about, these principles have changed my relationship with my biological children. They've changed my relationship with my husband. They're universal in application. We are wired for connection. And unfortunately, kids in the foster care space, they have had a lot of broken connections. And so we want to be the people that help restore that so that they can have a lifetime of healthy relationships going forward.
Great. Well, Jenni, thank you for joining us today. And I know people who are going to be listening to this are going to be really impacted, and some of them hopefully are going to have their lives changed because of your obedient yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate y'all.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, will you help us reach more people by subscribing, sharing the podcast with a friend, and leaving a 5-star review? If you've been inspired by what you've heard today and want to learn more of how you can make a difference for kids in foster care and the foster families where you live, visit americaskidsbelong.org. We depend on individual donors to fund our work. We'd be grateful if you would consider joining us as a monthly donor. Visit americaskidsbelong.org to make your tax-deductible donation. Thank you. Together, we can ensure a family for every child in foster care and a foster-friendly community to ensure every foster family feels loved and supported.